this? I don't think I need it at all. I'll just speak this way.
What was that?
Thank you for being here, and it's a treat to have Peter Jarrett-Schell, Reverend Peter Jarret-Schell, here with us. And Peter's going to be talking about reparations in the Diocese of Washington. Peter has been doing a remarkable job guiding the diocese into this conversation, and I am grateful for your leadership in the diocese. It culminated. Well, it hasn't really culminated, but we got to a stepping stone, a significant stepping stone a few weeks ago with our diocesan convention and approval, unanimous approval of reparations in that convention principle. And that's really thanks to your leadership in guiding that through. And one of the things that I've taken note of for us here is the way we did along the way to create a lot of opportunities for people to come together and think about it and reflect and talk and feel differently about it. So thank you for that. So have that. Okay. Well,
this kind of operations that's a little weird to hear my voice with the amplified that way. It's really great to see you all. My name is Peter Jarret-Schell. I'm the rector of Calvary Episcopal Church. We're down on H&6 near Union Station. I've been there about 10 years. My wife, the other Reverend Jarret-Schell, is the interim pastor at St. Stephen's Incarnation. I'm here. And as mentioned, for the last 5 or 6 years, I served as the chair of the Reparations Task Force in Diocese, which is now resolved because the resolution passed. But I will be serving on the education working group that was created as part of that resolution. So I want to talk to you about kind of what we're doing here in the Diocese of Washington on reparations. I understand you're reading Juan's book, which is great. Have you asked him to speak here? He's in D.C. So
he's coming in a couple of weeks.
He's fabulous. He's great. So let me talk kind of then specifically about kind of how we're thinking about in the Diocese of Washington and what we're doing. So I'm going to talk to you some of the elements that were in the resolution about the next steps are kind of also more specifically how we're thinking about reparations in the Diocese of Washington. So what I'm going to kind of give you tonight is kind of a sense of how we're moving forward in the process. Because again, Episcopal does a great job of kind of laying out an argument for why this is necessary. This is kind of how we're thinking about what it looks like to actually move forward into it. So we have this working definition of reparations that the task force used. This is adapted from the definition that the Diocese of New York gave. We put a little ideas in it that sort of made sense to us. What I identified reparations for us is a spiritual process. And we want to really begin there. But that's our grounding and understanding of this. I think that's important and significant because obviously you probably noticed the last 5 or 10 years or so, I'm going to stop real quick. I've been told I talk too quickly sometimes, so tell me to slow down if you need to.
I work in New York.
That's fine. Dealing with a lot of Southerners sometimes, so it's different. But also, I've been told that I'm kind of long-winded, so please feel free to interrupt, raise your hand, ask questions, say, okay, you got that, and move on. The spiritual component is going to be essential for us as Episcopalians as we think about it. Obviously, you probably noticed that there's kind of been a broad public discourse around reparations. It's got new energy and invigoration in the last 5 or 10 years. This is not a new idea. I really want to lift that up first. But from the very beginning, even before the abolition of slavery, the concept of reparations for the treatment of African Americans in this country was already present and there. And there were models, projects that were brought forward about how this could take place. This is not new, but we are kind of a moment where there's a new interest in it and a new idea, a new feeling that this might actually be a practical, plausible thing to carry forward. A lot of that has happened in the sort of secular realm, but we do consider fundamentally that this is a spiritual process, because otherwise, like, you could find a lot of organizations that are doing this. This is how we ground it as Episcopalians. It's a process to remember, restore, and reconcile. And those 3 elements are really important. First, that we are remembering. And so that's kind of an essential piece, particularly as we talk to people who have been on the receiving end of these harms. The remembering, the telling of stories that have been covered over and ignored is an essential piece of this process. And restoring and reconciling. And this goes to the spiritual piece, that we are kind of pushing towards the idea that what we're hoping for, what we're leaning towards, is the restoration of right relationship. Now, the Reverend Neil Fisher Stewart, who's been probably my closest partner in this work, has pointed out, in the first sense, that these words, restore and reconcile, actually may be misnomers. Because both of them, if you kind of look at the etymology, imply the idea that at one point there was a right relationship. That has never been the case in this country. That's an important piece, I think, as we think about how it actually needs to move forward. Because in a certain sense, while the idea that this is an important work to undertake is clear, there's no roadmap for it. There's been no process of reparations that's actually achieved kind of a fullness of what it hopes to undertake. So we're finding our way forward. Unfortunately, there are a lot of people that are kind of stumbling forward together, so there's a lot we can learn as we go. So make amends for historical and continuing, and that piece is really essential. That we can identify the way these forms are going on right now, and we can identify the ways that the Episcopal Church, and the Diocese of Washington, and our congregations are still perpetuating these forms. Historical continuing wrongs against humanity, and this part is really important. They can never be singularly reducible to monetary terms. About 6 months ago, we held in the diocese a conversation with the Reverend, Dr. Kathy Weeks, the director of the Episcopal Diocese Center for Racial Reconciliation and Healing. And she brought up, and she's actually quite critical of the idea of reparations. I think you should probably take seriously what you said about it. But she brought up a story, and she shared this publicly, so I think it's okay to tell, about how her brother, when she was quite young, took ill with a very easily treatable and preventable disease. And he was brought to the local hospital, which was a segregated white hospital, and refused service. And so because of that, they were sent to the local black hospital, which, as was frequently the case, was deeply under-resourced. They simply didn't have the technology or the medication they needed to treat him. And as a result, he died. And his death essentially broke her father. She said he was never, ever the same again. And she asked the question, how are you going to pay for that? There's no payment for that, right? So we have to acknowledge when we're dealing with these historical harms that in some sense there is no making them right. There's no paying for that much blood before I'm going to use blood. And even to assert the possibility of it is in some sense deeply insulting. So we have to acknowledge they can't be used in monetary terms, but also acknowledge that they must include a substantial investment and surrender of resources. And we think about it this way for a couple of different reasons. And if you're reading those books, you probably got a sense of this, so I won't take too long on it. In a practical sense, kind of on the secular side, they must include substantial investment and surrender of resources, practically because there's been a huge amount of plunder, right? And those assets are still held. So we have money, resources, endowments, real estate in this diocese that are still operating, that were piled up through participation in chattel slavery, right? We have other asset slips that have been taken and stolen from various black congregations in a variety of different ways and transferred into white congregations. I have to say, I really, really admire St. Columba's willingness to actually lift up that story. It's really remarkable thing to do there. You're not alone in that story. It's a common one. So there's this plunder of resources, and that was a great thing, right? But also, because in a practical way, in this country, while money can't solve all problems, right? Every single problem in this country is conditioned by money. We're always trying to find like ways as a society that we can sort of clever our way out of the wealth gap, right? And there is no clevering our way out of it. It has to be faced head on, and that includes this transfer of resources. On a spiritual level, right, it's important for us to recognize this as Episcopalians and Christians. Because if you look through the Gospels, just by the numbers, Jesus' favorite subject to talk about is the kingdom of God, right? And right behind it at number 2 is money and what we do with it. And for him, those concepts are deeply, deeply intertwined. So we can look, for instance, at the story of Zacchaeus, right? When he comes down from the tree, he agrees to actually do this process of making restitution, reparation. He says, anything I've taken, I'll pay back double. Give a quarter, half of all my wealth to the poor. It's probably impossible for him to actually do what he's claiming to do. But it's only after he's made that commitment that Jesus says, today salvation has come to his house. Right? Also, we know that Jesus tells us, right, where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. And so we have to acknowledge that unless we're actually willing to do this substantial investment and surrender of resources, the claims we're making about wanting to work towards racial justice is necessarily insincere, right? Looking, I think, at our personal finances, you can see how that operates. You can see how it operates in two directions, right? You give money to things you care about, right? And any priest who's trying to raise money for their budget will know what they tell you. People will give money towards the things they care about. But also, once you give money, right, then you care about it more because you're invested. You want to see what happens. So in that sense, until we're actually willing to make this transfer of resources, we're not going to care about racial justice the way we should. We also say, there's one of the guys, there's a typo there. In the Episcopal Diocese is working for making reparations for its participation in wrongs against the black community of this region. And we want to lift up that degree of specificity for a couple of reasons. First of all, we do not deny in any way, and we've tried to lift that up in this whole process, that there are other groups, right, that can also make a claim to justly be compensation. Most notably, of course, in this region, the indigenous folk, whose land, stolen land, every single one of our congregations is. There are many other groups further along the story that kind of continue to build this project of American racism and white supremacy, who can probably say that they're doing something as well. We don't deny that. But we start to deal with the black community for a couple of reasons. First, in this country, anti-black racism is absolutely foundational for all of the other racisms that kind of get built up on it. They're all kind of created in reference to it. Second, because you got to start somewhere, and you got to deal with it in specificity. So when we talk about this piece about remembering these wrongs, right? Each of these different communities has a distinct and specific story to tell, and a distinct and specific path towards making restoration. And there's a real danger if you're going to lump them all together, right? That we're kind of flattening out those stories, which is another way to move violence here. Every single person that we spoke to, every single kind of black community that we spoke to, both within and outside the diocese, elevated the importance of telling that story with specificity. And the final reason that we're focusing on the black community here in the diocese right now is because it's still a living part of our history, right? In some sense, you could say the diocese is very blessed because we're not nearly as white as most Episcopal dioceses. We have a very strong contingent of strong black congregations and strong black leadership, but who also can tell within the span of their own lifetimes this history. And so it's important for us to kind of start there with some degree of specificity, acknowledging that if we actually went through this whole process, told the whole story, and somehow made right as far as it's possible for us to do so, there would be other stories that we need to address now. Any questions? Okay. I'll offer, this is, like I said, finding our way forward and kind of looking back and kind of say, how did we get to where we got, right? So this is sort of a process that we've talked through, that we built retroactive, right? This is like stumbling our way forward and noticing that this is kind of how we recommend going forward on it. And it's a loose roadmap, so it'll move around a little bit. But basically, I would suggest that if you as a congregation are thinking about moving towards making reparation as a congregation, these are roughly 6 steps that you might want to think about as you move forward. The first one is building relationship. And this is specifically building relationship with the communities to whom you identify that you have done wrong. Building relationship is essential for a couple of reasons. Number one, because the harms of racism occur in relationship, right? We often kind of fixate, because it's relatively recent in our history, on the period of segregation, which seems like a broad welfare relationship. But the reality, when you actually look at the history, is that race relations between blacks and whites in this country have always been marked by a deep and kind of perverse intimacy, right? Sometimes when we say intimacy, I think it's actually, I don't know. Sometimes literally in those terms, right? But definitely always across friendships, family relationships, it's always been marked by this deep intimacy and a certain perverseness that's broken. So restoration has to happen in a relationship. The other reason, though, it's absolutely essential is that the history of white progressives trying to be accountable for this history. There's a long history of white people deciding what it is that black people really need, right? Which is another way to kind of loop back into the story again. And reading and doing the research is really, really essential, but there is no remedy for actually having a relationship with someone who will hold you accountable, and who will hold the story like how it was told. Particularly because that story has a lot of peculiarity in place and location you can kind of look at, right? And so the relationship over here are part of having the story that actually needs to be told and made whole. Any questions about that? How do you go about building a relationship? Again, no roadmap, and you notice in your own life, right? You kind of stumble your way forward. But broadly speaking, what I would recommend to any congregation, I don't know where you're in the process. So if I'm talking about something like we already did that, please just jump in. I don't want to waste your time. Broadly speaking, what I would recommend is you want to reach out to black-led organizations that are working on a project of liberation and economic empowerment for the black community. And the reason why I do this is because well-meaning white folks, right? 9-1, I think. Well-meaning white congregations understanding the importance of relationships, and often, as is the case in this country, having very few black relationships. Right? There's a Pew survey that kind of came out that 75% of white Americans do not have a single black friend. And this is not just survey data, so this is if you ask them a question, they'll say yes or no. So that in that amount is not included, like people who say, I do have a black friend, and there's Jeremy at work, you don't actually know him. It's like very, very little sense of connection and environment. So well-meaning white folks in these situations will also often reach out to basically any black person they can find who would be willing to actually do this work. A whole lot of black people don't want to talk about this, right? Because it is traumatic history. There's a lot of people who just don't want to deal with it. And that's to say you don't want to deal with it, that's not fair. Who don't want to talk about it, particularly with white people. And then 100% their right not to. So if you build a relationship, if you're reaching out to black organizations that are dealing with this directly, you know that you're actually dealing with people who have made the decision publicly to engage, right? They're already kind of saying, yes, I'm into this. And then reach out, start making phone calls. There are dozens of organizations, particularly in our region, that are working on this. And you start making phone calls and say, hey, we're thinking about doing this. This is about the scope of what we're trying to do. We want a partner that's going to work with us to figure out how to do it right, how to do it well. And in those conversations, and I can tell you because we discussed with the pastors, you'll find a lot of suspicion and skepticism. Right? A lot of them are like, I don't know, I'm not sure you're actually mean this, I'm not sure I want to do this. And you will find people who will tell you outright no. In encountering that skepticism and suspicion, the very best advice I can give you is to be as honest as you can possibly bear being. Right? Be as forthright and clear. And as you begin making those calls and connections, eventually you will find people who are willing to work with you. Right? You work with them, and when it's clear that they're willing to work with you, then at the end of the conversation, then you ask, who else should I talk to? Right? And they'll point you that direction. So you begin building those relationships. You also want to build relationships internally, because this is long-term work that both internally within yourself and in your congregation and in your diocese is going to encounter a lot of resistance. And you need to have partners along the way. They're going to support each other, encourage you, help make you accountable as you move forward. Next stage is truth finding. Gail talks about this really leans into this. But often we're ready to jump into truth finding, but we don't actually know what it is that we are apologizing for. Have you ever had the experience in your life of talking to someone and be like, you know that you did something wrong for whatever reason, you just had that vibe, and you apologize and you're like, I'm so sorry that I did X, Y, and Z. And they tell you that's not a problem at all. The problem is something else, right? Okay. So if we're not doing this work of truth finding in a relationship, we might actually not know what the harm is that we take it part. So that's a long process. It involves a whole lot of research. Your church, St. Columbus, is part of the congregational research partners that have worked with the task force, kind of investigating this history. We've been working with two historians, Franklin and Robinson, who can kind of tell you about, at least in terms of the paper trail, about how to investigate that story and bring the pieces out. It's not easy. It's a whole lot of kind of chasing leads, and he said basically you follow one line as far as you can, and you see where it branches off, and you follow that one. And you hit a whole lot of dead ends, and a whole lot of gaps in history and narrative. And then along with that, again, in relationship, there's a whole lot of listening, right? Listening to people's stories about what is coming up. That process of listening is kind of where you bridge the gap between the history, which for this diocese could be as much as 200 or 300 years old, and the current moment. And that's really, really essential. It's tough to build that bridge, right? It's tough to actually acknowledge how these problems are still ongoing. As we think about this whole discussion on reparations, it's telling, I think, the current interest and the current momentum around it very much was sparked by Ta-Nehisi Coates' article about the case for reparations. But what's interesting is that in terms of the movement and the action that kind of spun off of that, most of it, and we started this way too, was very, very much focused on the history of child slavery. And that's the storytelling. And what's peculiar, the reason I say what's peculiar, is because his article is not about that at all, right? His article is about housing discrimination in the post-World War II period. The reason that we, I think, do that is one, because the inhumanity of child slavery is so dramatic, right? And so sort of eye-catching that it captures our imagination. But also it's something that we kind of hold at a fairly safe distance, right? And don't acknowledge the way that, my own living situation, where I live, the wealth that I have, is complicit in things that have happened within my lifetime. So, and this is a place I think, like I said, stumbling forward. Looking back, I think it would have been far better if we actually started in the present moment and then worked our way past to the back. I might actually encourage other congregations that are thinking about it now to try to work that way. To consider what's going on right now and work your way backward from there rather than starting in the past and trying to figure out the connection to the present moment. After the truth finding, and again, this is just a continuing process that we're still getting into. We've come to the point of making our resolution to the diocese. We, as a task force, we were dissolved. But one clear piece we said was that in the next stage of the process, we had to create this education and working group because there's more of the story to uncover itself. And we just right up to the very end, there's little pieces that would keep coming up and full big kind of holes in the historical narrative that we don't quite know what was going on and the ways we were complicit there. After truth finding, you gotta get the truth teller. And there's lots of different avenues and ways that you can do that. I think the most important thing to understand here is that it is a public act of confession, right, that needs to involve the whole congregation, but also the community that surrounds you, right? And we, again, acknowledge this as Christians, the importance of this, the importance of public confession. We do it every Sunday. We acknowledge the part we take part in. And that telling there, the truth telling, is an absolutely essential process, and it's part of this whole process of reparation and repair and healing. In fact, most of the partners that we spoke with said that if you could only get this far, right? If you could just get this far, it would be a huge step forward, and probably more important than everything comes next. Having said that, I'm not going to get off the, you'll get off the hook for the rest. But getting to the full truth teller, to uncover as much of the story as you can in relationship, digging through the records, and telling it publicly with as much honesty and lack of evasion as possible, right? Because you don't want to like hedge whatever, just like to tell it. Is really essential. Then comes repentance. We're in that right now. We're all here on Wednesday, so we kind of think about repentance a lot. Repentance, every pastor will give you a different definition, but broadly I suggest your pastor will tell you something different. I'm going to suggest that repentance is the process of turning away from sin and towards God, right? So it's about making a change in the course of your life. And so repentance at a congregational and diocesan level is about structural change that works towards attempting to stop these harms from continuing, right? It's, in that sense, it's focused towards the future, right? How are we going to stop doing the things that we've done? How are we behaving more equitably and more justly going forward? And there's a lot that's involved there. A really crucial piece is looking at the leadership of your organization, the leadership of our diocese, asking the question, is it genuinely representative? Are we making space for the people of color, both in our congregation, our diocese, and neighborhoods surrounding us? to shape the direction that we're taking, to help be part of that decision-making process in a really central and important way? Are we properly compensating them for their work? All of these pieces need to be considered as we go forward. And for us, and again, this is a piece that Gail hits on, for us, as people of faith, as religious organizations that lean heavily into the work of signs and symbols, we really have to consider the deep way that whiteness shapes so much of our iconography, our hymns, our theology, assumptions about the European perspective shape all of those things, and be willing to actually distinguish between the cultural inheritance of whiteness that sort of makes us feel comfortable and the gospel that we come to receive, right? And that is deep work of digging in, particularly because generally at this point in time, we have gotten really hard to sort of coding that code the way whiteness shows up in our iconography and theology, so it's not immediately apparent. I'll say this, it's generally not immediately apparent to white people. Most people color coming to our churches read it very, very clearly, and they will tell you about it if you have enough trust in a relationship with them. And then after repentance comes reparation, right? And this is the point where we're actually saying, this reparation, repentance looks towards the future. How do we stop the things we're doing? Reparation looks towards the past. It says there are harms that are still impacting folks today, right? And if you simply stop doing what we were doing before, right, folks will still get a disadvantage, and so we have to try and make that right. Both of these are absolutely essential, because if either one's missing, you'll see that you can kind of continue to cause harm. If you just change things going forward, right, if you just get things right going forward, and much of the community is still operating at a loss because of lost time, lost resources, lost wealth, all of those things, we're not going to get protected. But, alternatively, the Episcopal Diocese of Washington and all of its developing white congregations, right, could divest themselves entirely of all of their balance, of selling all the land and hand it over entirely, and could still go on, right, engaging in white supremacist harms, right, quite often just institutional. So you got to have them both. It's not an either-or thing. And I mention this also because we do get confused about this sometimes. We'll focus on one, and we'll talk about how our efforts on one of these points is equivalent to the other. So for instance, if you talk about reparations programs, right, you'll see a lot of congregations and dioceses that have projects and programs that they've labeled as reparations programs. And what they're actually doing is sort of set-asides, where they're saying, we're going to ensure that a certain number of our contracts, a certain number of our staff positions are going to be people of color, are going to be black folks, right? Well, that's just what we should have been doing always, right? That's moving toward the future, trying to make sure that going forward we're acting more equitably, but it doesn't deal with actually the harms from the past. Conversely, and this is something that I, to the extent that, well, I do lie awake at night, particularly after we pass the resolution, I wonder about next steps. Conversely, one, and again, Captain Leeds talks about this, one of the big concerns that you will hear from especially members of the black community who are deeply committed towards racial justice around the idea of reparations is that it will become essentially a way for white institutions to write a check to say we did the work, even if you do it at a very large level, and still go on doing the harms, right? So we've got to move. And then, you get through all of those, then comes evaluation, right? To look at our efforts, right? And sort of say, did we make the mark? Did we do it? What are the parts that we did? What are the parts of the story that we're missing? When did we kind of soft pedal when we were telling the truth, right? What are the lingering elements of white supremacy in the operation and structures of our institutions? Where did we, roll the estimate on what we actually owe, right? And that process of evaluation happens internally, but also specifically externally with those whom we identify and we get calls from, right? So it's kind of the process cycles, and you should expect that if you get your way all the way through, you're probably going to have to start back at the beginning again. Dave Margiano, who is the pastor of Memorial Church up in Baltimore, probably some of you have kind of heard about their efforts on this front, said when they undertook this process, he was very, very clear, and the leadership team, their reparations leadership team was very, very clear about telling the congregation, this is not a project we are undertaking. This is a new identity for us as a congregation. We are going to be a repairing congregation, right? And again, this is something that I hope that as Episcopalians, we have certain resources to understand it, right? Episcopalians have always kind of been in the mindset that our spiritual practice, weekly participation in the Lord's Supper, daily prayer, all of those pieces, daily reading of Scripture, are a process that kind of grows us towards refinement all the way through our lives, right? So we don't like receive the Lord's Supper one Sunday and then be like, it's done, don't need to do it again. Right? We understand that this is a cyclical process that continues, right? So, right. But that's, any questions? Yes.
On building relationships, maybe look back at that slide. You were suggesting that we start with people of color, the injured parties, who are willing to talk to us. But those aren't the people we really want to reach. We want to reach the skeptics, the people who don't particularly want to talk to us, at least not yet.
So,
how do we do that?
Yeah, so there's a couple pieces I would hit on there first. I would challenge your sentiment that these are the people we really want to talk to, right? That kind of relationship with members of our community who do believe this is important and essential is actually very, very important. And without that, you're just going to go off the rails. You're going to come up with something, we're going to come up with a project that is very satisfying for us, and makes us feel good, but doesn't actually get us harm. But in terms of you're saying building support and bringing people on board, it is really essential, and I agree. So here's what I would say, is that it's important for us to identify our stake in this work, right? And this is something I've asked every member of, white member, in particular the task force, of why are we doing this, right? And it's a really important thing for you to be able to grasp and get a hold of. And that is a point of connection that we can have with people who are skeptical. I'm going to address that in a second. But the second piece that I do want to lift up is that what do we think about bringing people on board, right? We are often going down a sort of rabbit hole because we have this assumption, right, that what we need is to get absolutely everyone on board, right? And the only way we're going to do that, in my opinion, is by watering down your endeavor to the point that it becomes meaningless, that it's palatable for everyone. So instead, what you want to be thinking about, I would suggest, is a critical mass. What is the critical mass of folks to make this possible? And the reality is that a critical mass is pretty evidently actually a minority of folks. The bishop is fond of citing research that demonstrates that in an institutional body, if you can get 30% of the people on board and committed to a particular change, that change is essentially inevitable. It cannot be stopped at 30%, right? So that's the thing personally I would say. So rather than looking at the most intractable opponents, which we often do, right, who you're not going to convince, what you want to be doing is focusing on the people who say, okay, well, people would say something like this. I can see that it's owed, but it's not feasible, right? It's not practical, right? So the people who have some degree of sense, or at least curiosity about saying, this might be a thing, but I have my doubts. And those are the people that work towards. Honestly, this is just in terms of my own sense of my time and my energy. I just stopped trying to convince people who are really attracted. It's a waste of my time. We both argue with each other, and nothing gets accomplished. So it's really kind of about reaching out to the people who do have some capacity. There's a great book by a writer and a musician that came out recently. His name is Andre Henry, and the book is called "All the White Friends I Could Not Keep." And he talks about this whole principle in great depth. I would strongly recommend it. So with those folks that are sort of saying it's not feasible, it's not possible, then the question is, how do you get people off that sense of like, I'm on the fence, or maybe I can support, but I'm not actually engaged? How do you get them on board? And I think engaging that question of their self-interest is really, really important. And again, we have a unique capacity to do this with people of faith, right? Because we're one of the few institutions that will tell you that giving up something, right, is often important for your growth. We talk about sacrifice. Reparations work is definitely sacrificial. Sacrifice, I think we often get wrong in the Christian church, where we just don't quite do the full picture of it. Right? Sacrifice sacrifice is not just about, wait a minute, I have to have a second cup of coffee. Self-denial. Sacrifice is not about self-denial. Sacrifice is about giving less, letting go of something you value deeply, so that you can put your arms around something that you greater value. And every single time that Jesus talks about it, he talks about it in those terms. So as Christians, part of what we say is a clear apprehension of the kingdom of God, and our understanding that apart from actually putting our treasure where we want our heart to be, from actually making restitution, we cannot participate or be part of the kingdom of God, is an essential part of this. If you want to get maybe out of the spiritual realm, some other pieces that you can make that are very real. One is that, this is mostly white people. So speaking as a white person, right, and you may say that you don't feel this way, or challenged by it, I think most of us have a deep sense of anxiety around our participation in white supremacy, around the legacy of history. And the reason I'll say that is when you bring up this history, how quickly people get defensive, right? In my personal experience, when someone truly believes that they are not in the wrong, they do not get defensive. They simply say, that was me, I didn't do it, and it's over, right? So there's a deep sense of anxiety about participation in this, right? And wondering, questioning about what does it mean for me and the possibilities, the advantages, the course of my life, that there's this whole pile of plundered wealth being supporting me along the way. So the process of reparation is the only path really towards finding that sense of wholeness that gives us a sense of confidence of where we stand. Anything like Shakespeare? Hamlet, right, is that we've seen Claudius is in the confession, right? And he's praying, and Hamlet's about to kill him, decides not to, and then we hear he's actually praying, and I can't remember, but he says something that makes that my thoughts are going up, but my heart remains below, and the question he asks is it possible for me to be forgiven and retain the effects of my crime, right? Keep the crown, keep all of those things. And Claudius at least has the honesty to acknowledge that it is not. And I think most of us understand that it is not. So that's a piece as well. On a very, very practical level, we can point to, I think many of us, regardless of where you sit on the political spectrum, are very concerned about current trends in our nation, right? And there's just abundant and overwhelming research that demonstrates that the equity, the degree of equity in a society correlates directly with its prosperity, its well-being, and its stability, right? And we live in a deeply inequitable society. And particularly the inequity that surrounds anti-black racism is like deep and intractable and baked in until we're looking at it at all. So this actually speaks to the health of the nation, and I really believe that. Is that it?
I'm going to ask you to use this so that
Okay. Ooh, yeah. Can I sing?
Yeah.
On building relationships. In my family, for a lot of reasons, we've been talking about where and how to transfer the wealth, the substantial wealth of that. And in building those relationships, how do we make a difficult assessment of the black community? So we have friends, there are congregations, there are many organizations involved in this.
Yeah.
I've been involved in a whole series of nonprofits, etc., where there are groups who claim to represent the community, and they don't.
Yeah.
They claim to be in tune, they're not. So if we're going to take substantial resources, investment, surrender them, and turn them over, how do we find the partners in the black community
That actually have the confidence of the black community?
that are also going to do something with it? That's real.
So I'll give you two different fake answers to that. Go to the next slide. Can we go back maybe one? Yeah, there you go. Here's the answer, pardon. You're not going to get it right. And the expectation of you to get it right is partly kind of what you need to address. You're going to do as well as you are people, right? And there'll be missteps along the way. I see your face, just stick with me. The reason I bring that up is because, generally speaking, as conversations around reparations have come up, there's always this desire to maintain control of the asset, even as we're giving it away. So if you look at the way that these projects have generally progressed, a lot of them them have gone forward and sort of down from us, right? Where like a diocesan organization still maintains the privilege and the right, right? Saying, you have to show us all receipts. You have to show us all the bona fides, right? Before we decide to take over. You have to prove to us that you are worthy of this wealth. And I just want to think for a second about it. We're actually acknowledging, right? This is a surrender of plundered assets. This is the equivalent of stealing someone's car, and they come back and say, I need my car back. You say, but I don't know what you're going to do with it, right? It's a peculiar statement. Having said that, I will tell you that all of our partners did say, look, there are a lot of organizations and individuals that do not have that sense of support in the community, right? And so when I say the question, you have a confidence of the wider community, that is, I would say, that's the standard and metric that you're looking for. But the community has said, we've seen what these folks have been up to, they've been here with us, we trust them. And there's a lot of organizations in this area that can kind of make that claim. If you're really surrendering a lot of resources, you probably want to, again, it's come back to the relationship, you want to ask around a little bit within the community, right? So it's going to take some work. But I would suggest that confidence piece is the essential piece. Because, I mean, the whole history of like white progressive engagement around this has always been tied to this idea of like worthiness. Like, even if, which is not reparations, but if you think about welfare, there's always this question on, you shouldn't be doing that because we don't know what people are going to do. Well, it's like, it's not really a business. That's the answer. But do make sure that they have kind of a deep relationship, and there's longevity as a piece of it. Like, how long has an organization been working in the community? And if you ask about a little bit, it doesn't actually take that long to find out who has the confidence of the community. And that's, again, I think that's probably the only metric that matters. This piece is essential. I understand the question you asked, but you got to get it wrong, right? We are digging our way out of a very, very messy mess. And you don't get a messy from without getting first of all. You're going to make mistakes. You're going to have to eat humble pie. You're going to look back and say, boy, we should have done that differently. Now, looking back 5 years into the work of the Reparations Task Force, I would have almost entirely backwards from the way we did it. I had to do it over again. Right? I can acknowledge that now. But I think this is the essential piece. Not just when you fail about that battle, like I spoke to the same effect. This is actually my brother-in-law repeating this to me over and over again. No, he's an addict. That would be impossible. No. I like that, I'm sure. It's just to fail, it's to have the expectation, right? We're going to get this wrong, but we're going to try and fail better the next time. Again, we have a really clear framework as Episcopalians to talk about this, and it's right there in the Baptism of the Covenant. What I think is probably one of the best crafted phrases in the Book of Common Prayer, right? Priest asks you, we've probably done this several times when we read about this tonight, will you persevere in resisting evil, and whenever you fall into sin, repent and return to the Lord, right? It's a beautiful little sentence, and it has kind of all the essential pieces. First, it says, do your absolute level best, right? To do right, to do what God asks. Like, there's no slacking off, and I'm just going to do everything I can, resist all the way through. And then the assumption, right? Because it doesn't say if you fall into evil, it says whenever you fall into evil. This is going to happen. And then the question is, will you turn around and try to get out? And the last piece is to acknowledge that when we see that we've gone far astray, we require help to get back on the path. Repent and return to your Lord, right? And again, as Christians, we acknowledge Christ is shown in the bodies of those we need. So it's going to be a friend or a neighbor that acknowledges how states to you how you've fallen down and makes a recommendation about how to move forward. And the more you can prep yourself for that, the better off you'll be to carry through for the long term. Because again, when we began building relationships, when we began having these conversations, the question we asked of every single partner as we began saying, we started working on this work, was first, imagine we finish, we come through 5 years later and we come to some kind of resolution around this. What would make you say that it would have been a good use of your time, right? And what would make you say, boy, that was a waste of my time, I wish I had done something different. So think about that partnership. And the sense of flagging energy, right? The sense of people getting frustrated when they get, they see that they've gone the wrong way, when they're called out, when they're critical pieces, and turning away from it was the biggest frustration that people would about, right? They said the most important thing for me to be able to say after 5 years that, yes, this was my time, is that you consistently made the commitment to continue going forward, even when it's through you made mistakes along the way. Right, so this is a quick overview of us, some history. This was all in the resolution, so I'm not going to waste a huge amount of your time here, but ask any part that you want to know along the way. Again, this is an artifact of, in some sense, of how we went about it, because it does start with title slavery. I can see some people straining and swinging, so I will read. First of all, so much more uncovered. We don't know what. But first, here's some pieces that we do know. All congregations were funded by the colonial era tobacco tax gathered in large part from slave plantations. When we started this work, we were really curious about whether or not there were any Church of England congregations in Maryland that had actually owned slaves directly. And the reason we were curious about that is we already uncovered some research in Virginia that indicated the answer to that question was yes. In fact, the Virginia plantations, the Virginia congregations, Church of England congregations, were the model for slave plantations. They were the first slave plantations in this country, and they kind of exported it to everyone else. This is how you go about it. The Virginia Church of England congregations, the Maryland Church of England congregations were dealing, in a sense, with the same problem, which is that at that period, colonial America was considered a total backwater, and they wanted educated clergy, but no educated clergy wanted to come out. So the question is, how can we get wealth to attract them? Virginia, what they decided to do is they were going to take the glebe, so land that surrounded the parishes. They were going to purchase enslaved Africans, they were going to attach them to the glebes, and tell these Church of England priests, if you come out here and be our pastor, we will retain the land, the enslaved people will be the property of the vestry, but you will receive all the profits from the plantation, right? And that's how that started there. Here in Maryland, it's a little different, and it doesn't look like partly because the Church of England in Maryland is looking at the situation in Virginia and was like, that's distasteful. So they wanted to do something different, and they came up essentially with a scheme. You may have heard stories like this, but basically, this part is fact. They came up with a scheme that kept their hands clean because they had an intermediary, which was the colonial government. In Maryland, Church of England was an established church, and therefore the local government could fund through taxes, right? And so they had tobacco tax, they gathered from every plantation, and they apportioned it to Church of England congregations based on the number of people that were living within the parish boundaries, right? Which whether they were free or enslaved, which meant that if you were the pastor of a congregation that had a large number of plantations surrounding it, you were paid more. It was still slave money, right? It was passed through the colonial government's hands, so there was an appearance of cleanness. We know for a fact that this gets revised, Reparations on the war work, most records, vestrymen, and most large number of records were themselves enslavers. We have a record that at least one congregation did profit from sale of enslaved persons as a congregation. Franklin has not been able to establish how that happened. We know that it happened because he has the bill of sale from a slave auction, and it lists the seller as a congregation. So what he suspects is that, because there's no evidence that that particular congregation actually having run a plantation as the Virginia ones did, is that there's some benefactor that requested these enslaved persons to the congregation upon his death, and because they weren't set up to run it as a plantation, they sold them at auction. We also know many church buildings were built using enslaved labor. We know this because there are lots of in-parish records, letters of thanks to such and such person for doing the labor of so many Negroes, or Africans. Okay. These assets still operate in the diocese today. Not only the real estate, and not only the buildings, but also the endowments that can be directly traced to wealth as policy industry. Again, I'm long-winded, so just want to cover along here. Okay, this is a part that I think is really essential. Following emancipation into the present, we have other examples, but these are the ones that we have well documented. Assets from around the black congregations were transferred to white congregations. In the most extreme and extraordinary example of this, and again, all these congregations are telling the story, so I think this is fun to tell you. There are two Our Saviors in our diocese. There's Our Savior of Brooklyn and there's Our Savior of Philadelphia. Our Savior of Brooklyn was the original church. Brooklyn, during the 40s and 50s, transitioned to being a predominantly black neighborhood. They convened a meeting with the bishop at the time. The bishop's suggestion was that they should try and found a new congregation outside of the Beltway that had been constructed at that time. It wasn't a place. There would be a place for the white Christians who would leave it. It was technically a mission of Our Savior Brooklyn, but all of the assets went. The financial assets got transferred, and the physical assets as well, including notoriously the church bell was taken down from Our Savior Brooklyn and put into the bell tower at Our Savior Philadelphia. Upon the closing, black congregations' assets were sold and transferred to white congregations. Again, you've been involved in kind of telling your part of that story, so I don't need to tell you that, but you are not alone in this. We actually have several other examples well documented of this happening. And then there's this piece, and again, Joe really wanted us to lift it up, so I'm lifting it up because it's really important. Our sanctuary has been involved in economic that elevates whiteness. This is not just, I would say, our predominantly white congregations. Most of the black congregations that have access to go into their sanctuaries, you see the same thing. Because the indoctrination, there's such thing as internalized racism, and it afflicts our black congregations as well. And we use Christian education curriculum that assume and privilege a white perspective. And these are still things that are true today. The general sense in terms of like how you think about this this makes us feel comfortable, right? And it's important, right? We lift up the whole we're a congregational church, right? We lift up the image of God. So being able to go to church and see yourself represented is important for everyone, right? But when one side is domination on what that looks like, right? Then we're being benefited because we come to be comforted and we see, the image of God reflects on us. But every black person that comes to the door sees a different message, right? God does not look like it. And those things hurt and continue to hurt. Okay, so here's what we did. We did take about 4 years, a little more than that, sharing and educating the diocese regarding its history and participation in anti-black racism. Actually, we tried to do this in kind of a holistic way. One that both engaged and researched the history of diocesan level participation in chattel slavery, that also tried to deal with the more contemporary aspects of it, but we're also trying to kind of spread it out to the diffuse. So we formed this cohort of congregational research partners, again, where the congregation is one of them, with members who are willing to kind of engage and research that history and lift it up in front of them. We were surprised to discover that we're actually still finding congregations that have been doing this work on their own for years, if not decades, right? And kind of felt like they were an island to themselves. And we began connecting them. So some members of this research partners have been doing it for a very long time. St. John's Global had an exhaustive history that they were ready, they'd already shared. Others were taking their first steps in. So they were in all different places. But each one of them really committed to digging into their own history, finding the kind of the traces of this harm, this anti-black racism, and telling it. We also we convened a research project on the diocesan history. We also convened a research project which definitely informed our later efforts on recent institutional reparations initiatives. Right? So again, there's this current moment, there's some momentum around this. And there are, I'm sure you heard about Georgetown, Virginia Theological Seminary, Princeton, Diocese of Texas, and a bunch of other places, some municipalities that have done a lot of this work over the last 5 or 10 years. And it occurred to us that there was enough activity that you could actually kind of begin to learn what were best practices along the way. So we commissioned a researcher to look at these projects and divide them into 2 categories. This is really coarse, apologize. But successes and failures. We defined failures as being when the general community response was, it would have been better if you had done nothing at all, right? Which is the response to a lot of these projects. That was good. And there were several. In fact, some of the response to Georgetown's project has been on that one. It would have been better if you had done nothing at all. We defined successes where there was evidence, strong evidence of sustained critical engagement constructive critical engagement from the community, right? So we could see comments that were like, we're really glad you're doing this. This is the other piece that you need to look at, right? Or we're really glad you're doing it, we need you to go further. Gave us a sense that there was an actual sense of buy-in, right? It gave us the sense that you cared about it enough to sort of say, we want you to go further, we want you to do better. And began to look at trends between successful projects to kind of identify best practices and the unsuccessful ones to identify pitfalls. Right? I would say they were very diverse, but the two pieces that kind of came clear, very, very clear were, and go back to the relationship piece, you don't have to switch the slide, but early engagement. Right, and serious engagement with the community to whom you are playing digital harm, or acknowledging the harm, early engagement in the decision-making process, early engagement in every stage of it, led to more successful outcomes. And the second piece, which is why I picked part of the St. Rebecca quote and the Episcopal Covenant, was preparation, right, for disappointment and conflict along the way. The more you had kind of prepped that work at the beginning, saying, well, along the way, we're not always going to agree, and how are we going to move forward, what structure are we going to have in place to deal with criticism, to deal with conflict, all led to much better outcomes as you went along. So we did that. We passed this resolution, so many of you were there at convention. The formally convened the Majority Black Policy Working Group, which will spend the next 2 years drafting a hard plan of diocese reparations for convention consideration in 2 years. 2 years. Also, just to let you know, you have to be at that time of day. I'm definitely one person, so. If I'm slurring my speech, I apologize. So what we are charged with is, and that group has been, I believe in last conversation, it actually has been formed and will be announced within the next week or two. That group is charged with identifying what our targets are, both in terms of financial and other more immaterial assets and resources. This includes volunteer commitment, things like that. What are our hard targets? We're saying this is what we're going to achieve. What are our timelines for dispersing? How will we disperse it? To whom? How will we make those decisions? If you guys would we decide to partner with them? And what are our structures for accountability to go along the way? So they're going to do that all, present a report at next year's convention, and an actual resolution in 2 years for the convention to go on. It's also going to be an education working group that's going to continue the work of unearthing and sharing this history with the diocese at large. And kind of try to bring to as many people who do have some willingness to actually make this happen on board to get actually off the bench and into the game. So I think they may do another one. That might be it.
Because we're 8 o'clock, so we're
see?
a couple of minutes.
Oh, okay. Alright, so, and I'll finish this right now. Yeah. Okay, so, a couple things about this. Number 1, and this is going to sound terribly apologetic because I feel terribly embarrassed about this. Church publishing, looked at the work we're doing, and said we'd like to write a book about it. I asked 3 of our accountability partners, right, and I sort of said, a big piece that you've lifted up is really important to people telling their own stories, so this is a little weird. And I was very much hoping that they would say, you shouldn't do it, because I didn't want to do it. I didn't give much time, maybe about 3 months. All 3 of them said you should do it. And the reason they said you should do it is deeply, deeply heartbreaking. They said, absolutely, right? We should be the ones telling the story, and we should be the ones that are being heard. But the fact is, when we tell people the story of our lives, black people, white people, do not agree with us, right? Or dismiss them. But if a white person has heard these stories and repeated them and said, I think these need to be heard and told, sometimes some white people will hear. So they go ahead and do it. All royalties, in terms of partners, we're talking about those 2 curious Bible streams. The Black Abolitionist Community and Defense Fund, centering all black lives, most at risk of state-sanctioned violence in the greater Washington area. So they work right here. All royalties will go to them. Mostly, I would say, what the book is conversation, precisely the people that I've mentioned, kind of need to be in relationship with. Drawing from them in these conversations, what are best practices along the way, how they think about it. They have some absolutely brilliant insights, so I do recommend it. In terms of the questions you asked about who should be secret partner, actually there's one piece that I think is really important. is that ideally you want to be working with somebody whose perspective and power analysis makes you at least a little bit uncomfortable, right? And honestly, and this is not because these folks, Harriet's Bible streams are incredible. They're incredible organizers. They definitely make me uncomfortable, right? And not in a bad way. But they're very, very smart in their vision of what needs to be done. And it does, it's a little hard. But if we're hoping to grow a relationship, that's where we're going to be, right? You showed up on Wednesday. We couldn't be doing anything else, right, for Lent. Because we in our tradition understand that if we want to grow in our relationship with Christ, sometimes it's going to make us uncomfortable. And if you're leaning away from the, there's no resurrection without the cross. So lean towards the folk, I would say, who do make you a little bit uncomfortable, so help keep you accountable and help you grow in your relationship with Christ and in your sense of what this work entails. So that's the end of that. It's 8 o'clock. Any other questions? I have 3 copies left if you want to buy them now. And I'll say this. So I say all royalties, those are my royalties, because church publishing still takes their cut. I can't do anything about it. Good talk. If you buy it online, I would recommend you buy it from church publishing, because then Amazon doesn't take the cut. One of them is here as Bible streams. If you buy it online, it's $25 and change or something. If you buy it online, basically $2 goes to higher grades Bible streams. But I have 3 copies of it. If you want to buy one tonight, because I purchased the $1 discount, $8 goes to them, so that's that. Any questions?
Can you see yet appropriate your slideshow?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you can use it here.
Sure.
That's please. Yeah. We also have other resources which I can email you, make available. We have I know you're doing this now. We have a congregational curriculum that's about kind of undertaking the work at a broader congregational level of uncovering that history and telling it. We have the report document from King West, our researcher who investigated these institutional reparations initiatives. So a deeper dive into kind of his sense of drawing out what are best practices, what are pitfalls. I'm happy to share all that information. Everything we produce, we're happy to share.
Peter, thank you so much. This was